Hello, my name is Alan Prost, and I'd like to demonstrate for you today the effects of compliance and resistance. To do this, I'm using a test lung and a manual bagging unit. The relationship I'd like to tell you about is compliance is the distensibility or the elastic nature of the lungs and chest wall combined. This is reflected in our test lung by this spring. When I push air into the test lung, I distend the spring, creating pressure inside the lung, much like the thorax. So as I decrease compliance, the lungs are stiffer. So it requires more pressure to push in the same volume of gas. And this is reflected on this pressure gauge here. This pressure gauge shows us the pressures inside the lung. This other pressure gauge shows us the pressures here at the mouth. So decreased compliance requires greater pressures to hold the pressure, hold the volume in the lungs. Where increased compliance, the lungs are now much more flaccid or more flexible, less elastance. To put in the same volume of gas requires less pressure. So let's look at that close up. So this pressure gauge here reflects the distending pressure, or the pressures inside the lung itself. This gauge here shows us the pressures here at the mouth, or the mouth pressures. So as I decrease compliance, what you're going to see is it requires greater pressures to inflate the lung to the same volume. So with decreased compliance, it requires greater pressures, about 70 centimeters of water pressure, to push the same volume of air into the lungs. If I put that same volume in now with increased compliance, so the lungs are more easily distendable, and I put in that same volume, it requires less pressure. Resistance is the force or the pressures required to overcome the small diameter, or the resistance of the endotracheal tube in this case. It requires pressure to create flow. I have to have a pressure gradient, and the pressure gradient I'm talking about right now is the pressures at the mouth and the lung. So I need a high pressure here to deliver pressures into the lungs. So during flow, when I'm actually pressing the bag to get flow into the lungs, you'll see that this pressure gauge is much higher than this pressure inside the lungs. That's because I require force to overcome the resistance of the endotracheal tube. And we'll look at that relationship mathematically in class. Let's take a look at the pressures close up. So as I'm forcing air into the test lung, you'll notice that this pressure gauge here, which is measuring the force of the pressures right here at the mouth, and this pressure are different. Initially, while there's flow, as I'm pushing the air in, you'll notice that this gauge goes quite high, above 100 centimeters of water pressure, where this gauge slowly builds up until the pressures in the lung equal these pressures here. Watch this. So as I hold the volume in the lungs, both pressure gauges are reading about 45 centimeters of water pressure, reflecting equilibrium. But during inspiration, as I have to overcome the resistance of the endotracheal tube, these pressures are much higher until all the flow is stopped and they're in equilibrium.